Okay, so picking up right where we left off, we have this 360 animation, and now that we have it, we need to animate it. Or excuse me, we've animated it. Now we need to render it. So how do we do that? And actually what I'm going to do, because I liked the fire, no, we'll leave it on this one for now, and then we'll look at the fire one. So let's say we're happy with the animation, and it's time to render it. Or you're happy with the draft and you need to kind of evaluate it more real time. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump over here to the render settings, and we'll go through some, not all of these settings, but we'll start here with the render engine, the most important. By now you should have hopefully changed this to cycles, because that'll have an effect on the material process, but if not, make sure it's on cycles now. And we're using the supported feature set, so you can leave that alone. And then devices, you can use CPU or GPU computations. If you are using the GPU, you want to go to Edit Preferences and look at our system options here, and you can see the cycles render devices. This is what I have installed. So I can use CUDA rendering on the RTX 2080. There is also, you can go based off of the processor as well. Optics support is experimental at this point, so you can use it, but it's not going to give you the full thing. So if you've got an NVIDIA card, CUDA is pretty great. Otherwise, you can also use OpenCL, but this is what I have set up. Just make sure if you do want to use this, just need to check that box. That's all. So once we have that set, you can continue down here in the render properties. We have sampling, and we can do path tracing or branch path tracing. With all of these options, you can hover over, get the tooltip. So branch path tracing branches the light rays on the first bounce. So the way that this renderer is working is it takes every source that's bouncing light around, or actually I think it starts from the camera side, but it emits light rays, and it follows that bouncing around, and that's kind of how it calculates what the light is doing. And then the samples is how many times it does that. So in the viewport, right now the viewport renderer is set to 128 samples. So I'm going to just go into this rendering menu set. Well, no, let's go to the layout menu set. And hit 0. And just to clean up my view, I'm going to click this button right up here. This is going to turn off my overlays. And I'm going to hit Z and go up to rendered view. Now you can see up here on the top left, path tracing sample, it is rendering, and it's going through the samples in consecutive order, so it's just rendering everything together, and it's almost at 128. You can see as it gets closer to 128, this noise disappears. Okay, it's still noisy, so it's still not exactly where we want it to be, but it's better. And so that's what these sampling numbers are. I like to work in factors of 2. So it's going to be 128, 256, 512, 1024, 2048, 4096, 81 something or other. I don't really feel like doing math right now. And the higher you go, the better this will look. Now you don't have to stay in those numbers. You can just type in 3000 if you wanted to. But the point is, the bigger number, more samples, better quality render, but also it'll take longer to render. There is an advanced tab, which I'm not going to get into. We have light paths, so this is the maximum bounces for each type of light. So for a diffuse light ray versus a glossy reflection, versus if there's transparency in your scene or transmission, you can adjust those. There's also, if you click in here, you've got some presets. So something like full global illumination is just going to give nicer results overall, but again, it's going to increase render time. And I know we've talked a little bit about rendering before, but I figured I'd refresh you as we're getting into the animation side of it. So I usually do jump to full global illumination. Clamping will help with fireflies. You can look at all of this stuff on the Blender wiki too. If you go to the help and go to the manual, it'll pull up the Blender manual, and you can look at all of the really detailed information about this. Volumes we're not going to worry about. Hair we're not going to worry about. You can turn on motion blur, which is usually a pretty good thing to do, and the defaults are fine, but it's going to feel a little bit more realistic there. Film, leave the exposure at 1. You can adjust that, but leave that at 1 if something isn't bright enough or is too dark. Change your light. Don't just change the exposure. If you do want to render on a transparent background, you need to make sure that you have transparent checked. Otherwise, it won't happen. Performance here. We get some additional performance options. Really, the only one you can worry about, at least initially, is this tiles value. And you can just do a bunch of tests, render it, change it, render it, change it. This is definitely more important to keep it as a factor of 2. So 16 to 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, probably at the high end. I have heard that for GPU rendering, larger tiles are better, and for CPU rendering, smaller tiles are better. That's not been the case for my system and the tests that I've run. What seems to give me the fastest render times is about 32 by 30, or is 32 square. Again, do some tests, see what works best on your system. This number might not be accurate for everybody. And then not going to worry about baking, freestyle, or color management. So not a whole lot to worry about here in the render tab, but there's a few other settings that we also need to change. The second one, this is our scene properties. We've got our resolution. I was rendering out thumbnails or banner images, so that's why it's set so high. But for us, we can keep this at 1920 by 1080 full HD. 100% is if you want it to render out smaller, like temporarily for a preview or whatever, you can just bring this percentage down to 50%. It'll render out at 50% of that size. Aspect ratio 1:1. Keep that there. Frame start and end. Okay, this will be automatically updated based on what you change down here. They will mirror each other. Step, if you want to render every other frame or every 5 frames, just as kind of like a test preview, you can do that and enter that there. So if I entered a step of 10, it's going to render every 10 frames. Frame rate 24 frames a second is what we want. That's US NTSC film standard. Video standard would be 2997 or 30 frames a second. And then if you're in Europe and the PAL system, you'd probably be at 25 frames per second. Time remapping, we're not going to worry about. We're not going to do any 3D stuff, so no stereoscopy. Output, this is where it's going to render to. So by default, it goes in the temp folder in the C drive, but I'm going to navigate to here, and we'll say Raygun Renders. I'll create a new folder, and we will call this 360 Preview, because I'm not going to actually render out the full thing, because that's going to take forever. But I'll do that, hit Enter, double-click on it, and click Accept. You can say, now that path has been updated. Overwrite, so if you render multiple, if you keep making tweaks and re-rendering, then you can check that. File format, I'm going to keep it at PNG, because PNG has a transparency layer to it. It has an alpha channel. So if I was rendering with alpha, I would definitely need to have both PNG enabled and color would need to be RGBA. I believe you can also do transparency with a TIFF format. It's a larger, it's a more robust format, but it's more data than we really need to worry about. And then I'm going to set compression to 0. It's by default at 15%, but I'll keep it at 0. Color depth is 8 bits, and that's fine. And then from there, let's see, metadata we don't really need to worry about, and post-processing, we're not going to do any compositing in Blender, so we can ignore that as well. Moving down the line, we have our view layer properties. Most of this we can ignore. I do have denoising enabled, and this is just the default denoiser. I'm actually going to disable that. Well, no, we can keep it enabled. Never mind, and it should be fine. This will help speed up render times because you don't have to add quite as many samples to get rid of this noise. Yeah, I guess the thing you need to make sure is that you still need to have enough samples. If this probably easier just to show. So I'm going to set my render view to 128. Okay, and I have denoising on. I'm going to hit F12. That's a shortcut to render. You can also go up to the render menu and hit render image. And you can see I've got some issues. So let's adjust that. I'm going to hit escape to cancel that render. And let me look at my scene. You can see I have my area light is set to not render, so let's turn that back on and turn the backlight on. Okay, I think that's everything. Now I can hit F12, or again, that's in the render menu. There we go. Now I can see things. Good. You can see as it renders, it's going to render each square individually. Again, we've rendered before, but it's the motion that's going to be new this time. So that's 128 samples. Yep. I go back up render, view render, F11. That's actually, I'm kind of surprised that was enough samples. That's cool. So that took 23 seconds. I don't know why this suddenly decided to... There we go. Okay. So you can see we rendered frame 735. It took 23.9 seconds to render. It used 100 megs of memory at its peak. And that's what we get. So that denoising actually did quite a bit. I'm going to change render slot to 2. So basically what I can do is I can save multiple renders in the buffer, multiple still renders. So I'm going to go to slot 2, and I'm going to change my render settings. Let's go to like 32, just to compare. And go to render, render image, F12. That's going to go. This is going to be even faster because it's less samples. So the last, I like that it keeps track of what your last render was. So the last render was 24 seconds. This one is 12 seconds. And now you can see there's this splotchiness happening. And that's because the samples are too low and that denoiser doesn't quite know what to do because there's a lot of noise there. To further compare, I'm going to keep it at 32 and I'm going to turn off the denoising. And we'll hit F12 to render again. And you see it renders faster, but it's noisier. So that's with 32 samples. So low samples, no denoising. Here is low samples with denoising, and you get the splotchiness, which we don't want. And then we'll go back to slot 1, and this is higher samples with denoising. And that's looking pretty good. This is a pretty simple scene. So that rendered really fast. And that was, we can hit N in the window, and we can, let's see. I thought we could look at, there we go. Go to metadata, and you can see what your samples are at. The samples are at 128. And looking at this, we can kind of zoom in here. I'm actually pretty okay with that level of detail. I was expecting it was going to have to be up higher. But with this lighting, we're not doing anything too complicated, so we can keep that there. Okay, so let me make sure we set that back to 128. And then, let's see, what else do we have? We have this last scene. We have the scene settings, which are good. World settings is good. Okay, so now we've got the settings where we want them. Let's actually render this. So if you want to render the full animation at full quality, once you have your output path defined and your render resolution, just go to render and render animation. I'm not going to do that right now because I don't want to sit through 240 frames at 30 seconds a frame, which would end up being about 2 hours, I believe, because we can do that math real quick. We have, we'll say, okay, so it's 24 seconds a frame times 240 frames is 5,760 seconds. We divide that by 60, and you get 96 minutes. So a little over an hour and a half. So I'm not going to sit through that. I'm not going to pause this and wait and then come back. I just, that's the process. But what you can do, if you want to preview this animation, is one, you could just kind of lower this resolution and get, like if I go to, not 5%, if I go to 50%, and hit render here real quick, you can see you get much smaller, and this is only going to take 5 seconds to render, so that's much more reasonable. So you can do a low quality one. You can also, if you go to the view menu here, we can do a viewport render animation, and this will render in whatever whatever your display type is in the viewport. So if I go to solid view, it's going to render in solid view. It's going to look just like this, but it's going to render those frames. So I'll do that real quick. I'll hit view, viewport render animation, and it's going to use the same frame range that you have set here. It's going to use the same resolution that you have set here. And it's going to go through everything. You can see the cursor turns into a little counter, counting up the frames that it's rendering. It's going to be just whatever you're seeing in the viewport. So once it finishes, I can jump to my Raygun renders folder. You can see here's the 360 preview, which is where it rendered, and it renders all of those frames individually. Now, because I'm doing this as a viewport render animation, I can keep that at 100%. I'm also going to go back to my material preview, and I'm going to hit that one more time. So view, viewport render animation. It's going to count through that, and you can actually watch over here. I may have kept that off screen and you didn't actually see what I was looking at, so apologies for that. You can see it's actually overwriting these images as it renders those frames. So that's pretty handy. So it's going to go through that and give me preview quality, and it's going to happen in a fraction of the time of what the full render would take. Okay, so once that's done, okay, it finished up. So we got all 200 or 700. It's 240 frames, but it's frame 500 to frame 740. So once we have all that done, now we can compile that into an actual animation. And you can do this in Blender, but I think most of you at this point are very familiar with Premiere and After Effects. I'm going to use Premiere. It's, I think, the simplest way, and if you're familiar at all with editing, it allows you just to get right in there and edit in a more comfortable platform than necessarily Blender. So I'm just going to close that window, and I'll minimize that for now, and we will open up Premiere. Okay, open up, and I just have a miscellaneous project that we'll open up here. Okay, so we'll get to this here in a second, but to import this image sequence, we're going to go to File and Import. Okay, and we're going to navigate to our preview. I'm going to select just the first image, make sure image sequence is checked, and click Open. It's going to import it in. I'm going to immediately rename it so I know what it is. Raygun 360. Then I'm going to right-click on that clip and New Sequence from Clip. Okay, it's a very similar process in After Effects. We'll zoom in here. I'll scale this up, and now I can hit play, and there is our previewed animation. Okay, so from here, to actually export it, I'm going to hit Control M. It's going to bring up my export settings. Otherwise, it's in the This is another one of those things that I always use a shortcut, and I never remember where the actual menu item is. Export media, Control M. So I'm going to set the format to H.264. Set my output name and path. That'll work. I'll click Save. I'm going to hit Match Source to make sure my resolution is correct. And then I'm going to hit Export. And this is going to be really fast because it's just an image sequence. And there it is. So now I can jump back over here. And here is my Raygun 360. Okay. So you can do this for each shot that you have. And I would recommend actually doing this as a preview quality, so you don't waste a bunch of time rendering and decide you don't like it and you need to change something. You can do that as a preview quality, bring all of the clips into Premiere. And I've got this Firelight one that I did, and this was actually a real render. I also did this at half scale, so I'm just going to grab that and scale it up 200% so you can see the full screen. Okay, and you can decide, how you want to edit it. You can make those timing and pacing changes. Go back and make those adjustments in Blender before you do the final full resolution render. Okay. So there's what my test of the fire. I think I like the one I did here better, but that's it for rendering. It's a pretty simple process. It can take some trial and error to make sure you've got the noise reduced to the right levels. I'm going to turn that off. I'm going to turn the fire group back on. I'm going to make the fire camera the active camera. And this is going to be from frame 250 to frame 410. And let's hit play on that. Okay, we're also going to turn off this backlight. I don't want that visible. That area light. Okay. So, once you have something that you like, you've got your frame range set, then it's really... I'm actually going to do a quick test render here, so... and hit F12 to render the frame. Let's see how long this takes. You can see now here we're getting some more noise, and that's because I've got more lights in frame. So I'm going to have to up the samples a little bit. I've got this lovely depth of field kind of bokeh effect. This is where those blades on the aperture come into play. Like if I set this to 3. You can see now those are more triangular. Or we can go 7. Okay. Maybe I'll keep it at 7 for this. Hit F11 to bring this view back up. So you can see that took 22 seconds. But the noise is way low, so I might go back in here. I'm going to change my render back to 1024. And we will hit F11 to bring this back up. Go to slot 2 and re-render it, just so I can do a before and after. Do this, and then once I'm happy, I can hit render and go through that whole process in Premiere again, just like that. So that's it. Let me know if you have any questions. Again, feel free to check the Blender manual if you have any questions about any of these specific settings and what they do in a more detailed way. And good luck.